Hello everyone. Welcome. Happy New Year to you. How's everybody's New Year feeling, going? How's it flowing for you? I decided to go to a colleague friend's house party, so it was really great to still get in the New Year's vibe with some dressing up. But also just be with people who I love and adore and could just be myself and be silly, and so it was really lovely and beautiful. So how's everybody's New Year treating you so far? Hopefully good. Setting some intentions for yourself that are kind and meant to motivate you and inspire you to be the best you in 2019. Always thinking about being kind to ourselves. Really important key ingredient to actualizing whatever our goals might be for ourselves, especially when we think about that through the lens of justice. If we are to be just in the world or create systems of justice in the world, we have to always start with ourselves. Starting with ourselves is the most important ingredient to that work. So welcome everybody. So we are doing a continuation from last time we were together. And we are exploring a little bit about the conversation or content, if you will, regarding communication, specifically liberational communication, and how when we think a little bit about how we communicate, it provides us an opportunity to also think about how do we build community. When we think about community, how do we build community? How do we do that in a way that is very thoughtful and mindful about collaborations? And we briefly touched on this last time we were together, but collaborations that are cross-cultural, have a unique, distinctive process, if you will, because we all come to the table with different value sets, and we come to the table with lots of different communication patterns that we've learned within those particular family systems and cultural value systems. So when we think about communication, liberational communication specifically, there are some challenges in that collaborative desire. And typically, or not typically, but oftentimes, at times, there are particular aspects of our communication that really do affect that. So last time we were together, we started talking a little bit about that through the lens of a wonderful scholar and writer, Dr. Rosenberg. And he talks about communication through the lens of nonviolence. So today I want to kind of just talk a little bit about that specifically, because it's January, and January celebrates Dr. Martin Luther King. While I won't get into my political opinions about allocating one day for an individual, or any individual really, when we think about that, I won't get into that this time around, but just thinking about what the intention is or what the purpose is to really think about his life and his contributions. Dr. Martin Luther King was really for nonviolence, and he talks about nonviolent communication actually in some of his books that he's written. Quite powerful, quite intriguing. I wish I would have been better prepared this time for an excerpt from him. Maybe I'll do that next time we come together. Next time we come together, which will be January 17th. So just to recap, last time we talked about some of the communication blocks that we experience. And those communication blocks are 4 in total. The first, and what we discussed last time, was the concept of moralistic judgment. So moralistic judgment in some, thinking about judgments in capturing who is what within a communicative encounter. The second, in which we will talk about a little bit more today, is the concept of making comparisons, which is another form of judgment, but specifically related to comparisons. So a little bit different than last time we were together when we talked about moralistic judgments. The third block is denial of responsibility, and we'll talk more about that on January 17th, our next Transformation Thursday session. And finally, the last point, the last communicative block that Dr. Rosenberg talks about is life alienating communication patterns. And so there's a few that kind of encompass that category, and we'll talk about that on our last session on this topic on January 31st. So stay tuned for those conversations. But today, I want to talk a little bit about making comparisons. So to offer some structuring to thinking about that specifically, I want to read a little excerpt from the text, Nonviolent Communication. And this is really thinking about how judgments, what we spoke about last time, and comparisons create a system or an experience that promote violence. So let's just think about that a little bit through what he has to say. He says, American children are most likely to be watching the hero either kills people or beats them up. This violence typically constitutes the climax of the show. Viewers, having been taught that bad guys deserve to be punished, take pleasure in watching this violence. At the root of much, if not all, violence, whether verbal, psychological, or physical, whether among family members, tribes, or nations, is a kind of thinking that attributes the cause of conflict to wrongness in one's adversaries, and a corresponding inability to think of oneself or others in terms of vulnerability, what one might be feeling, what they could be fearing, yearning for, missing, etc. So when we think about communication blocks that really affect our ability to engage in compassion, the very core element of community building and collaboration, we might need to think about how we compare what is right and what is wrong. And in a culture that, as Dr. Rosenberg says, often values the rightness of the hero and the wrongness of the wrongdoer or the villain, if you will, sets the stage for a very strong belief system and is communicated when we conversate with other people. So when we think about communication block number 2 as a means to affect our capacity to really think about building community, it offers us kind of a core vantage point, if you will, to think about conflicts and how conflicts stem from judgments specifically being communicated with aggression. And so when we are judging through the lens of comparison, there is a natural seemingly aggressive, and when I say aggressive, I don't necessarily mean physically violent. We can be aggressive psychologically. But that aggression makes it nearly impossible, and I would argue impossible, just point blank impossible, to achieve collaboration. Because what might happen? Anybody have an idea of what happens? Have anybody ever experienced being compared or feeling like they're being compared in a conversation or a communicative interaction, and how that has felt for you? Well, I'll share that if I'm being engaged in a conversation and I have somebody comparing me to Sally, well, Sally was able to do X, Y, and Z in this time frame. Why aren't you, or why can't you? Our instinctual drive is to become defensive. And the reason why it's instinctual is because it's about survival. As a human species, we naturally desire the need to survive. So when put in a situation where we're engaging in psychological violence, where we are being compared or judged, our automatic reaction is to feel defensive because we're looking at it from the lens of surviving. And so thinking about comparisons specifically is another form of judgment. And specifically thinking about comparisons when we are comparing ourselves to others is really a kind of a mimic, if you will, on some of the normalized systems that many of us have been socialized within. Whether that's in our family system, many of you probably know what I mean, comparing one sibling to another, or cousins, and feeling what that might feel like. Whether that's in our school system, and using grading systems of some sort, or reward systems to compare students to one another, thinking that it's motivational. However, there are some core instinctual responses that manifest. Some students will resist that. Other students will internalize that, and then we begin to have a narrative of ourselves in comparison to others. Well, I'm not good enough because I didn't do that right because. And this narrative, which I would call a toxic narrative, really does inform our sense of self-worth, our sense of individual strengths, because we're not actually able to focus on our strengths. Rather, we're focusing on our deficits. And that specifically, when we think about comparisons, lend itself to the way that we communicate. And so when we are thinking a little bit about engaging in comparisons, whether that's of other people or whether that's of ourselves, there is a nuance of violence there. And again, when I say violence, I don't necessarily only mean physical violence, but we could, include that, because it could become that, but more so psychological violence, because we are engaging with self or others through a lens of aggression, through a lens of need for survival, the fighting mode, that fight mode, which is very instinctual for humans to engage in. And so thinking about that, I have a question, provocation for my community that are popping on. So how might making comparisons impact our capacity for compassion? Anybody have a thought on that? Anybody who's joining us on my Facebook family or my Instagram family? How might making comparisons impact our capacity for compassion? What do we think? What are our thoughts? So I can take a drink of water. Any thoughts? Can muse on that for a moment. So maybe we'll take that same question and we'll ask it a different way. We'll look at it from a different perspective. How might making comparisons influence our ability to collaborate? So if we're comparing ourselves and we're communicating that to others, how might that influence our ability to collaborate with one another? I'll say that in my own personal experience, whenever I've been compared, whether that's in a family system or whether that's in a professional setting, even in a friendship setting, there is a tendency, personally, because of my own experiences, I don't go into the fight mode, but I go into the fear mode. So I begin to feel anxious. So there's feelings of doubt, lack of self-worth, and so there's a sense of feeling a lack of. And if I don't feel like I have anything to contribute because there's a lack, it's very challenging then to collaborate because I don't have anything to offer. If I were to engage in that, which to be very authentic, that had been my response in my prior experiences in my life. And so really thinking about comparisons and how it's violent, there was psychological violence, not just from the specific experience of hearing somebody speak to me through a lens of comparison, but the own comparisons that I began to create in my own mind and how that facilitated psychological violence on myself. Because I didn't look at myself through a lens of kindness or worth. I started looking at myself in comparison to others. And this continues to persist in our society. I would challenge that I am not the only one to have a story such as this. That when we are being asked to compare ourselves, that while it might not create disequilibrium or uncomfortability because we're so used to it in our society, it instinctually doesn't necessarily feel positive. It instinctually creates a system of conflict, either within or externally amongst individuals whom are engaging in a conversation. And so thinking about engaging in communicative patterns that utilize comparisons as a really focal point in having a conversation, there are lots of challenges that arise, and thus is the reason why it is a communicative block per Dr. Rosenberg, and I would fancy that I would also agree or lean towards that direction of agreeance in really thinking about that. And building community specifically, when we think about the goal really is to allow people, parties, all parties involved, opportunities to be included, to feel valued for what they bring to the table, to move forward with taking collective action. And so if we are moving forward with the desire to create collective action, we each have to really actualize and understand with deep awareness what we have to offer, what is our strength. And so when we engage in communication with others or our own personal narratives to ourselves, using comparisons make it very difficult for us to actualize that. And so if we are comparing ourselves to each other, we begin to pass judgment on the value level of others and ourselves and what we have to offer. And so building community then is nearly impossible. It's extremely difficult to build community in that. Or we're building community where that's the foundation. Fear and doubt is the foundation, which I would say exists a lot in our society. And if we desire to shift that reality, we have to begin to think about what are all the components that affect that, and communication is a part of that. Not a sole factor, but a part of that. And we really want to create systems where we're not pushing people away, ourselves or others away in our capacity to collaborate. Rather, we are creating opportunities for more psychological closeness, for deeper levels of emotional understanding, for more physical closeness, so that we can begin to understand and see and feel what elements that we share, our commonalities, And those commonalities are the core key ingredient in thinking about compassion and community building, and how we are able to collaborate with others who seem to be very different than us, but at the core have very similar values as it relates to surviving as a human species. Our need for connection, our need for understanding, our need for inclusion. And yeah, those are some of my thoughts today as we talk a little bit about communication for liberation and community building. So I kind of shared a little bit about some of the blocks that we might experience. I talked a little bit about the perception or the viewpoint, if you will, of utilizing communication in comparing ourselves, and how that could be an expression of violence, and how violence then is a natural deterrent to creating systems of change that build community and really focus on enhancing compassion. And in the honor of Martin Luther King, really thinking about nonviolent action as a means to create change is really highlighted here. And so I'm just curious, I would love to open it up to some of my family that have joined us. Do you have any personal experiences with communication blocks as it relates to comparisons? Have you been compared? What did that feel like? Did you do you feel like you were able to feel somebody's compassion for you? Were you able to collaborate even though there was some comparisons that took place through communication? Maybe some examples of resiliency as it relates to that, because that, we definitely learn how to adapt and to be resilient. Or the opposite, where you experience communication experiences or situations where there was a comparison made through communication, and how there was some conflict that you experienced or a challenge with collaborating. Curious to see what you guys have experienced. Anyone have a personal experience that you'd like to share? As we think, if we want to share anything. Just want to give some reminders, shout outs. So thank you for joining me, and stay tuned, because there's a lot of really amazing things to come with Social Change Coalition. We have a new team that's starting on the 7th of January. So we're going to have some really amazing outreach efforts. We're going to be enhancing our collaborative agents and partners. We are expanding our network to more international waters. And so we're going to have lots of amazing events to come. So my next Transformation Thursdays is on January 17th. So join me on January 17th, and we'll continue to talk about this conversation of communication for liberation and community building, and thinking about that third block, denial of responsibility. And we'll think about that a little bit more next time. So thank you guys for joining me. Hopefully there will be some interest to share the next time around, share some experiences, as the goal is that this space is one to share and to talk. I don't mind sharing. I don't mind talking, but definitely would love the thoughts of others to kind of spark some more ideas around this and brainstorming. How do we navigate this when it's so ingrained in the part of our society's norm to interact with other people and to engage in community spaces, and what are some of our experiences around that, and how could we start thinking about shifting that truth or that reality, starting with ourselves, of course, And then once we feel a little bit more versed in that skill, then we can share with others. And then so it's that idea, one person can make a difference. You make a difference with yourself first, and then you have the capacity to share with others. So we have our wonderful community member here, Jalen. He's part of our community engagement and outreach team, and he shares in his experience that comparisons usually arise in heated arguments. It's so true, right? We're already activated with that emotion of frustration or anger, so it's easy to go to the violent use of communication. And he continues, the context of the comparison seems inappropriate to me, but when in retrospect, I think the judgment came from a place of love. Ah, yeah. I mean, for sure. You know, our family members definitely, or people that we really love, and it's just so much a part of the norm. So doing that is coming from a place of desire. Like, I care about you so much. I need you to really think about this. For sure, for sure. And so Jalen continues that he says, I think the hostility is what is causing the communication block, for sure. And so as I was sharing, when we think about communication specifically related to comparisons and judgments, there is a very strong link with violence. It's psychological violence, but it's violence, and tends to come from a place of uncertainty or fear. Very humanistic reality and truth. And when we have more awareness, we can begin to think of different ways. We don't have to go in fight mode all the time to survive. We could still survive without going into the fear mode or the fight mode. So thank you for sharing that. For sure. And I know in my own family system, that really was the case. There was a lot of judgments. I shared a little bit about some of my professional experiences last time we were together as it relates to judgments, but comparisons. I'm Mexican American, so as a Latina, that's heavy. There's a lot of comparisons that happen within family systems for Latino folks, and for me specifically, I would say that I really resonate with that truth. To be compared to people all the time. My mom would ask me when I'd come home with a particular grade, well, what's the grades of your other people in your class? Are they getting a B also, or whatever, if I'm not getting an A? And so it just kind of creates this internal reality. Well, like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm not, just my own grade isn't good enough. I really need to think about how I measure up. And perhaps there would be some disagreements with some of the things that I would say from folks. There are a lot of strategic plans and models around human behavior and communication that talk about comparing oneself in a positive manner. So I know that some of the things I'm sharing today could be very radical perhaps, or controversial, if you will. And so just thinking about that, how you felt specifically internally. How did you feel internally when being in a position where somebody compared you? And so to think about that, how do you actually feel, or how have you felt, if you will? And then thinking about, since this is how I feel, in the future, when in contact with a similar situation, or myself communicating, what mindful consideration should I have as it relates to communication? So, well, thank you guys all for coming. It's wonderful to see the wonderful community that connected with me today. I really appreciate your presence. For my Instagram family, live, we can't save the videos. I'm trying to figure that out. So there's no way to re-access the video unless it's within 24 hours. For my Facebook family, automatically records. So that's really amazing. So you can share this with your friends or encourage them to join on next time we meet, January 17th. Until then, I wish everybody a wonderful rest of your New Year week. I hope that you set some beautiful intentions for yourself, motivating yourself to actualize your most best self. Remember to be kind to yourself and give yourself a positive affirmation as you create those intentions, or revisit them if you've already created them. So much love to everybody, and stay tuned for all of our wonderful updates as it relates to our project and our events and things that will be happening coming soon. And I wish you guys a beautiful night. Thank you so much for joining. Take care.